Thank you. Appreciate it. Take care.
Take care.
You stay? All right. Okay. Excellent. All right. Bring it back. All right. Very good.
Everyone's attention. Thank you. Dustin, how are you today?
Good, Chairman.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I know that this has already been a very long hearing, so I will spare you from reading verbatim my written testimony. But I will tell you that I'm very excited to be here, to be coming to give you a testimony in relation to what it was like in an upstate county to implement early voting. But more importantly, I'm just excited to be here to tell you and thank you for allowing us to do early voting in New York and be able to testify instead of begging you and asking for this vital reform year in, year out, that now we are talking about how to improve it and how to make it better. And that is something that is due to the hard work of the legislature and Governor Andrew Cuomo in signing this bill and putting it into law and making New York the 39th state to enact early voting. I think anecdotally, early voting was a success in New York. Not only were we able to use 2019, a lower turnout year, to be able to get a test run, so to speak, but we saw a marked increase in turnout just in 2019 alone. Now, early voting isn't the end all of that, and I'm sure, no one thing is a panacea that will increase our turnout. However, the publicity around early voting, the publicity around all the election reforms that you made in the legislature, and also the ease in which it is easier to register to vote now in New York has contributed to these numbers, where we saw now almost 3 million people voted in New York State, as opposed to 2.1 million in a corresponding election in 2015. And in Onondaga County, which is the county that I'm from and I'm an elections commissioner at, we saw a similar increases. So this wasn't a regional thing; it was across the board. And but however, I'm glad that we were able to get this program into place to get ready for what I believe will be a very high turnout, very intense election year in 2020, and with 3 different elections in 2020 as well. I do wish that this hearing was a little better timed, because I would love more commissioners to be able to come and give their experience outside of New York City. But as has been noted, many of them are counting ballots as we speak. I was lucky my county was able to get done with our ballot counting procedure yesterday, so I got in the car and drove down here. And I felt it was important to have an upstate perspective on this hearing. However, I do humbly suggest that perhaps we have a hearing somewhere's upstate and in sometime in the near future. Syracuse is beautiful in January. You'll love it. I promise. But still, and hear other commissioners' aspects from around the state, because our upstate, we have a unique problem as opposed to New York City, where as New York City has resources, and the challenge isn't necessarily the amount of resources, but how they issue those resources, how they spend those resources, and they have the support of local governments for these election reforms. Upstate, it's not always that way, and it will vary from county to county. And so some of the things that I'm going to suggest here today in ways of improving our early voting laws is a way to bring equality to some of these counties, so you don't have these large amounts of differences from county to county. As was stated earlier, we did exceed the number of early voting sites in New York State, the minimum. However, that's really only because 20 counties exceeded those early voting sites. The rest of the counties, the vast majority, still did the minimum or just over the minimum of early voting sites. And part of the reason for that is the way the law was structured, the way it was passed, and I think now that we've seen the implications of that, we can affect change on that end. But before I get into that, I do have to say the most important factor that will go into whether we are expanding early voting sites is cost and support from New York State. The legislature was very wise in putting out $24 million in grant funding, and the state board was equally as wise to structure that in a way that encouraged county boards to increase the number of sites last year, and also I hope that we will do that again in future years. Because just because the equipment costs have been solved in some of the counties, not all of the counties have solved those equipment costs. And also, we need to continue to encourage these counties to invest in our democracy by having more and more early voting sites. And again, only 1/3 of the counties throughout the state decided to go above their minimums. So even with this financial advantage, financial incentive, it wasn't quite enough. And some of that is because of resistance on the ground on local government levels to this reform. As you know, I know Assemblymember Levine knows, for many years we were fighting to try to get this reform passed. The Assembly was trying, but met resistance after resistance from local governments, not just about the costs, but about the need for early voting. I think we've proved this year that the public likes it, and that the public wants to use it. And as we saw throughout the state, the counties that invested in early voting sites, counties like Erie, Dutchess, Ulster, saw market increases in early voting turnout. That's because their sites were closer to the people that were using it, because they had more sites. Erie had 37, for example, whereas other counties, even including my own, had the bare minimum. And the reason for that is because the way the law was structured did not allow advocates and also commissioners who wanted to expand early voting to be able to do that in many ways. Even though the state board gave financial incentives to do so, in giving you more money for each and every early voting site that you put in, many localities were resistant to that idea. Sometimes it had to do with the compact time period that we had, and that is a real issue that we had to deal with, because it wasn't just about finding out in January that the law was changed and that we had to get ready for this. We really didn't find out until April how much money that we had. We didn't find out until May how that money was going to be structured. We didn't know what the technology was going to be until middle of May and June. And at that point, we're preparing for our June primaries, because we've already changed the political calendar last year. So many counties weren't even making plans until July or August to get ready for early voting. And by that point, it was too late to add additional sites. However, there was also significant resistance to not only the number of sites, but where those sites would be located. We saw what happened in Rensselaer County, where sites were located outside of the urban center. We saw fights over sites on college campuses throughout the state as well. So these are the kinds of things that just financial incentives aren't going to resolve, and legislative fixes might resolve that. Because, for example, the current law is structured to have one site for every 50,000 full allocation of voters. Talking to vendors that I've been able to talk to over the last year who were selling us poll books, but also, they were in these 38 other states, that seems a little high. And many of them have said that other states are averaging one for every 30,000 voters. And having that one for every 50,000 was a good start for last year, but it may, if we want more sites, if we want these counties to have more sites, we may want to think about lowering that full allocation of voters and making sure that they have to have these sites. Also, the 7 max cap played havoc on larger counties that wanted to do more sites throughout the state. Nassau County, for example, Assemblyman Levine, then Commissioner Gugarty, now Judge Gugarty, wanted to have a full allocation of 19 sites in Nassau County, which was what the 1 for every 50,000 ratio would have been. However, because the law says that you cannot mandate more than 7, he had to go into a negotiation with those who wanted less sites, and it ended up being 1 for every 15. So while Nassau went above their minimum, they certainly didn't meet what the spirit of the legislation was intended to have a site for 1 for every 50,000 voters. So even then, we went above the minimum, but we didn't do enough to service the voters of Nassau County in many people's eyes. Now, this is all to get in preparation for next year. So these are legislative fixes that we can enact within the current law, which are just minor tweaks. But having more flexibility in the law would be something that would be beneficial to many larger in area counties as opposed to larger in people counties. Even counties like myself or other counties, we're looking for ways to maybe put pocket sites in certain towns, in certain areas that maybe not need full 9 days of site, but it's a rural place that is a rural pocket of their county, or, for example, college campuses. We all know that the 18 to 24-year-old age range is the least participatory in our government. And anecdotally, talking to them, one of the reasons that they give is that because there are no poll sites on their campuses. Last year, the legislature was very wise in passing a bill that mandated election day poll sites on campuses of a certain size. We should think about doing that with early voting as well. Why leave this reform away from these voters? Maybe it's the community college in every county that we have. Maybe it's, talking to SUNY colleges as well. We don't necessarily need to have 9 days. Maybe it'll only be 3 days. Maybe it is not feasible to have a full site there because it's away from where the residents of the county live. But the students who go to campus there, maybe especially in the cases of community colleges, are residents of the county from throughout the county. So, and there's faculty there as well. In my own county, I have a community college that has over 10,000 students that are residents of the county. Yet there was no poll site at that community college, despite my best efforts. Making sure that this group that is usually the least participatory in democracy have all the tools that they can to participate, and giving them an opportunity to early vote when classes are in session. It would probably be able to reach those people, especially in a presidential year. Another thing that we do need to concern ourselves with is encouraging our vendors to do better with their technology. The New York City Board talked about this a great deal. When it comes to, if we want vote centers, if we want large centers where people can go to any vote center, some of the limitations of our current voting equipment is keeping us from doing that. Even in my county, which I don't have nearly as many ballot styles, I found it difficult to do the vote centers that we did. We did 6 on-demand vote centers in Onondaga County. However, to be able to do that, we had to, because of the ballot marking devices that have audio sessions, and I don't have the language issues that New York City or other counties have. Even to do that, I had to have 3 different ballot marking machines in every early voting site, and have them programmed for different areas of the county, because the machines themselves were not able to handle a full 450 or so ballot styles that I need for them to be functioning on election day. So, we need to encourage our vendors to do better, to come up with better equipment, and also then we need to encourage have a funding stream for the counties to purchase that equipment as well. I mean, we live in a capitalistic society. They're not going to create technology that we're not going to buy, and we have to have the means to buy that technology as well. Which leads me to my last point is eventually we're going to have to replace our aging fleet of voting machines. And this, I think the general mood of New York State is to start to move towards a more effective and streamlined way of meeting our voting needs and having more vote center models and more of a system where people could go to any polling place and vote. Well, if we're going to do that, we need to have brand new machines. These machines that were bought in 2007, sometimes maybe updated a couple years later, they're aged out. They're going to be aging out, and we're not sure whether federal grants are going to be coming anytime soon. And New York State is going to have to pony up to make sure that our counties, especially our upstate counties that don't have the resources that some of the downstate counties have in terms of a budgetary allotments, that we have the opportunity to buy the newest and best equipment that we can actually give these new resources as we institute automatic voter registration, as we institute same-day registration, as we institute no-fault absentees, and where we start taking some of the election day populace out of the mix, we may be able to go to vote center models, but the technology is not quite there yet. We do see it happening, though, in places like Texas and other places that are ahead of us. So if we invest in that technology and mandate our vendors to start investing in that technology, I think that we can then start really moving New York forward. We took a big step this last year, and the boards of elections were overworked as always, and many of them worked many very long hours to make it happen. But now that we've learned from this, if the funding is there from New York State and we make some minor tweaks to the law, we can really propel the early voting laws in New York State to actually increase our usage, because that's what we should be looking at over time, not necessarily turnout, because as we register more voters, we're registering more voters than ever in New York State. Your turnout numbers, you're not really comparing apples to apples. You really need to be talking about usage and the numbers of people that are using it. 250,000 voters voted early in the inaugural year of early voting. There is no reason to believe that that is not going to propel 3, 4, 5 times next year in a presidential year. And what we've seen in the 38 other states that have early voting is that they start off small and they grow big, and they're breaking records each and every cycle. And I think we will see that in New York State as well. So I will end my testimony. I've given my written remarks. I'll take any questions that you have at this time.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator May.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. Always glad to see you at these hearings, and I appreciate your being such a warrior for democratic participation in our elections. It's really important. But you alluded to some of the difficulties upstate with actually choosing locations for early voting, and knowing what an activist you are in terms of trying to get more participation, it's probably a surprise to a lot of people that Onondaga County still ended up with just the minimum. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
Sure.
And what some of the barriers were that you encountered?
To be quite honest, I hit a brick wall. Even after the state board came out with their funding structure that gave us, more money and incentivized us with more money to open up more sites, the county government and my counterpart, at the boards of elections, we have a bipartisan team, which is, I think, a really good model, by the way, because it allows us to work together. But sometimes, in some instances, a block can come up, and in that, I was told that we were only going to do the minimum sites this year, despite the funding that was out there. I had I had a plan to put 2 more sites because we had holes in our county in the northwestern corner and in the southwestern corner. One of those sites was at Onondaga County Community College, and it was met with fervor, a resistance that I could not overcome. No amount of negotiation seemed to do that. Even though one of the sites that I was putting was in a very red portion of our county, and one of the sites was even in another red portion of our county, but located at the community college, there was no appetite for expanding early voting. And, even though it was being paid for in full by the state grants. That my experience is not the only experience. We saw fights over college campuses throughout upstate New York. Sometimes the college campuses are not suited for a full 9-day site, so I understand some of those. But we even saw a fight in Ulster County, which they eventually won. But they had the backing of their county legislature and county government asking for it as well. So we see these fights, and unfortunately, these are the people that are least participatory in our government and need these resources most. I don't understand why it got so partisan, because community colleges are not necessarily made up of the traditional college students, and they're made up of citizens from throughout their counties and in all different kinds of age ranges. So I don't buy that it should be a partisan battle. It should be about how you're servicing your county.
Yeah, thanks. And I had a question that I asked before on behalf of a constituent in Oneida County, but I wondered if you had thoughts about that, whether it makes sense to mandate that early voting sites be at places that are also regular voting sites.
In Onondaga County, all of the early voting sites we chose were at actual polling place sites. But I also think that early voting, as it's designed, is designed to be in places where there are large gatherings of people. So atypical voting sites, such as a mall, for example, or a college, or a downtown area, which may not necessarily be a regular polling site, but is suitable for an early voting site where you're having large amounts of people in there at certain times that can vote from anywhere in the county. Those are the kinds of areas where I think we do need to be flexible. So I wouldn't want to say that they have to be only election day sites, because the election day sites are usually smaller. There are some election day sites that are not much bigger than this room, and maybe half the size of this room that I have, because they're designed to service neighborhoods as opposed to large amounts of people. So I wouldn't want to limit it, but obviously consistency in sites that Executive Director Ryan talked about in New York City is something that we have the same concern in upstate as well. Having election day sites as a template to start with, but if you're adding on, you may want to look at some more sites that are maybe non-traditional, where you can gather more people as they're going by and shopping or doing other duties that bring them by an early voting site, and they decide, yes, I'm ready to vote, and I'd like to go ahead and participate in our democracy.
Okay. And finally, upstate, one of the issues is always parking. So
Yeah.
is that how big an issue was that in determining where to hold early voting?
It absolutely is an issue. But especially like in counties like Onondaga, but Monroe and others, it's a mix, because you have large urban centers too. So you have to have early voting sites that are on bus lines or in neighborhoods, and early voting sites that are in the suburbs that might need more parking than others. So it is something that is unique to upstate, the large amount of parking that you would need in rural counties or suburban portions of your counties, especially if you're doing not as many sites, and which is I would say an argument to do more sites, because then you need less parking, and many times you can do more sites for about the same amount of money, because the number of inspectors that you're using are the same. They're just at different areas. So you could do multiple sites in a smaller county for about the same amount of budget, with maybe some investment in more equipment. But in personnel, if you have more sites, then you lessen the need for parking all that much.
Great. Well, I found it very easy to vote early. I felt like the poll workers were happier and less stressed in some ways by the early voting, and good job. I know how hard you work to make it all happen, so thank you.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to do it.
Dustin, thanks for mentioning, or thanking us. But for the record, the Assembly has passed early voting in any number of iterations over the years, and without folks on the Senate side who want to make sure that everybody who can vote, who should vote, we wouldn't have this to begin with. And I just want you to know that I find your comments or analysis of Nassau County to be quite fascinating in terms of who determines where these early voting sites are. Nassau led the state in terms of early voting response, substantially led the state. And it's not even a matter of population, although Nassau does have a large population, but there were more than 30,000 people who exercised their right to vote early in Nassau County. And that's kind of interesting to me, especially given the fact that we had no early polling sites whatsoever throughout the three northern peninsulas, one of which I represent. So I'm going to take to heart your comment, and let's see where we end up at the end of this legislative session. Dustin, thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember.
Thank you, Dustin. I just had actually two quick questions. One, a clarification. The resistance that you met in trying to establish early voting polling sites at some of the SUNY locations, to be clear, that was not from the SUNY institutions,
No.
But from your fellow commissioners.
No. In my particular case, community colleges, SUNY community colleges fall under Article 4. They're going to provide spaces. Many of them already have election day sites set up for us, so we could easily roll into an early voting site. The professors, the administrators, they want to service their populace as well. I don't. In my case, there was no resistance. In the case that I've talked to with other commissioners that were trying to set up sites at college campuses, there was very little resistance from the college campus side. It came from more of the political arms and other commissioners.
Thank you. And you mentioned the necessity for us to replace our aging voting machines, and I'm wondering, because this inevitably will come down to what the cost will be, and I'm wondering if you have any sense of what you can't know what all of it might cost, but could you speak to perhaps how much it costs to replace a voting machine and what that might look like?
The current ImageCast machines that I use in Onondaga County cost anywhere between $10,000 to $15,000, and we have 250 or so machines, and we're kind of a small county. We're 300,000 voters. Obviously other counties have way more stock and some have less. The new machines there's leasing options. The voting vendors are coming out with more affordable ways to spread this out over time. But it's not going to be cheap, and especially if we're looking at machines that can handle, not 20, not 30, but hundreds or thousands of ballot styles to be able to give us vote center technology. They're going to be a little bit more expensive. So it's not. We're once we reach. There was a lot of funding back in 2007. Some of us still have our shoebox funding, but we reached into that to buy electronic poll books and other things this year. So and that shoebox funding is going to be expiring sometime soon. And whether it expires before we reach the next level of voting machine is a question. And whether I'm waiting for the next level of voting machine to start replacing my aging fleet, because I don't want to buy something that is going to be obsolete in 2, 3, 4 years. I want to buy something that is going to be able to handle the 2024 elections as opposed to the 2020 elections. And that machine, in my mind, hasn't been marketed to me yet. So.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, and I think our electronic poll books were the underrated MVP of the voting reforms, as it sped a lot of the process up. And I think that we, as legislative bodies, have a policy choice to make on how much our democracy is worth and how much we want to invest and how far we want to leap forward. And so, I look forward to having a continued discussion around this.
And thank you, Senator, for mentioning that, because electronic poll books is something that I was pushing even in absence of early voting. And I'm glad we were able to get them through, because they were a necessity for early voting. But using them on election day themselves that's something that we did in Onondaga County, and it made the post-election and pre-election process more streamlined. It made the polling places more streamlined. We can service these polling places with less inspectors and less confusion for voters. So electronic poll books are not just an early voting tool, but they are a tool to make our elections better. And I would hope that other counties that did not use them on election day would start to look at using them this next year, because I think it's going to make their post-election process better, pre-election process better. They're going to save them money on printing, and also it's more green. We're going to have less paper out there, and that's something that is something that I know a lot of us are concerned about.
Anything else? Great. Thank you very much, Dustin.
Thank you.
Next up, we are going to hear from New York City's Chief Democracy Officer, Ms. Rini Saboon.